Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be going over my most disappointing / worst reads of 2022. And this year, as opposed to previous years, I actually ranked these, and I also ranked my favorites of the year, which, like I said, I don't usually do. But I ended up just being able to come up with a pretty solid order for them. Obviously, sometimes, especially in my favorites, and we'll get to that obviously in my next video, probably next week. And in some ways, I could probably reorder some of the most disappointing / worst books of the year, but I will say this ranking is probably a little bit more solid than the favorites ranking. So anyway, let's just get into this. I'm going to start with books that I enjoyed but maybe were disappointing because I expected a little bit more from them, and we'll slowly transition down to books I absolutely disliked, had very strong negative feelings for. Starting with a book that I actually really enjoyed and I'm going to keep because I would love to reread it, but I was expecting this to be a 5-star like new favorite book, and it just wasn't. And that is A Rose for the Crown by Anne Easter Smith. I have heard people talk about this as one of the greatest Richard III historical retelling kind of situations. Specifically, this book is mostly focused on the fictionalized mistress of Richard III. We do know that Richard III had at least 2 illegitimate children that he did claim before he married his wife. However, we know nothing about their mothers. We don't know if they were separate women, if it was the same women. In this case, Anne Easter Smith decided to have it be a single woman. And I just felt like the characterization in this could have been stronger. I felt like the relationship between Kate and Richard could have been better developed. I felt like they just kind of jumped into it, even though it was leading us to believe as readers that Kate is this very moral, upright person. And in some ways that Richard was too, and yet it does not take them very long to decide to have this sexual relationship outside of marriage, which obviously at the time especially was very frowned on, particularly as Kate is married herself when it's occurring. So I just felt like a lot of the characters' actions didn't really match what we were being told about them. I also felt like some of the side characters ended up kind of blending together. There were a lot of like matronly figures and fatherly figures that all kind of felt the same. So while I was expecting to love this, maybe not as much as Sun and Splendor, but about as much, I did not end up enjoying this even close to that. However, like I said, I did enjoy this and I do want to return to it. Mostly my favorite part about it was the exploration of this time period with the Wars of the Roses and the goings on there from more of a third party perspective, someone who's not actively involved in everything that's going on and is really learning about what's going on more through rumors as opposed to being there for any of them. So it definitely had its positives, but it was a disappointment for me. Next, we have another book that I enjoyed a lot, but I did expect more from, and that is Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. I have heard so many good things about this book. It's kind of a book of anecdotes of this small town where there's a group of older ladies in this town who kind of are very central to the social scene, and they're a little bit crazy, but they're also very loyal to each other. This book had its charm, but I just was not that engaged in it, unfortunately, as I was reading it. There were some portions of it that I really struggled to even know what was going on because I found my mind wandering often while I was reading. Elizabeth Gaskell's writing is great, and some of the characters in this did stand out, a couple of the scenes, but because of how much people have raved about this book, I expected to like it a lot more than I did. Perhaps in the future, as I grow older, I may appreciate it a little bit more as I get closer to the age these women are. I may appreciate some of the relationship aspects a little bit more and the character aspects, but for now, I just expected more from it than what I got. And last in my category of books that I enjoyed but not as much as I wanted to, so more disappointing type reads, I have The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Jenkins Reid. This book has been raved about on BookTube for years now, and I was so excited to get into it. It's about this journalist who's asked to write the biography of this very famous actress from the 50s, 60s kind of era, and we are learning about Evelyn Hugo, her 7 husbands, and what happened with each of them, and just how she became who she became. And while I found Evelyn Hugo to be an interesting character, nothing else really was enjoyable to me. I didn't really like any of the side characters, although I will say the journalist I was fine with, But yeah, Evelyn, Hugo I liked, but none of the side characters really, I guess except for one. I can't even remember his name though. Harry Cameron. I did like Harry Cameron as well. But I just felt like the rest of them weren't that interesting. I felt like the plot ended up not being very interesting. Like it was very, I was expecting learning about just her life as a famous person and how that impacted her. But it was more about her sexual relationships, basically. That was a huge focus of the story, which is fine, but it's just not what I'm interested in reading about. And unfortunately, I did end up pretty disappointed with this. I think I ended up giving it a 3.5 on Storygraph. I may have given it a 4 stars on Goodreads, but I might end up changing that. The further I get from this and the more I think about it, the less I feel like I enjoyed it and the more disappointed I feel. It's still at a level of like, I enjoyed it. It wasn't like I completely hated this or anything, but it was just okay. Next, I have a nonfiction, When Women Ruled the World by Cooney. I think here's the cover, of course, as usual. I should have prepared for that better. But anyway, this is a nonfiction following an exploration of female pharaohs in ancient Egypt, which sounds so fascinating. I don't know much about ancient Egypt, so I was excited to kind of get introduced to a few different figures. And while I did get something out of this as far as information goes, and it wasn't like it was a pain to listen to, like the writing was fine, it just felt like it was more about feminist ideas and comparing ancient Egypt and how women were treated then to how they're treated now, particularly in politics, and in a way that was very obviously putting forward her personal political beliefs, which some of it I agreed with, some of it I didn't really, and it just came up enough as I listened to the audiobook for it, and it just came up enough to where it was distracting from what I went into this book wanting to learn about. I felt like she referred to modern day examples of things, but they were things that she was very heavily biased in her perspective on. And I just felt like I did not pick up this book to hear your take on feminism and how women should be better treated and how things like this have been going on for so many years. Like, I just want to learn about female pharaohs in ancient Egypt. And you can bring that up. It's not like you can't talk about it at all in a book like this, because obviously it is a solid point to discuss. But I would think that you would spend more time discussing it in the intro and or the conclusion, as opposed to quite referring to it quite so much throughout the book. And so I ended up being disappointed in it because a lot of it I ended up feeling annoyed by. So while I did still learn about several figures that I did find fascinating and just things about ancient Egypt and the culture that I did find fascinating, there was definitely some distraction with some of those comments and comparisons. And now we're getting into the books that I actively disliked. I only have 3, the first of which is actually a DNF, and I know a lot of people don't include DNFs in their worst books of the year. However, I don't DNF very much. I'm pretty sure I've only DNF'd 2 books that I can think of this year, and one of them it was just because it was bad timing for me, so I plan to get back to it. But this one I DNF'd because I could not stand it. Like, I just could not keep reading, and it was very upsetting to me because I had hoped this would be a hidden gem. And that book is The Witches of St Petersburg by Imogen Edwards-Jones. I don't even remember how far I got into this. I think it was like 150 pages, so a good chunk of the way, and I did not care about the characters. There were scenes that were actively gross. I guess I should tell you what this is about. This book follows 2 women who are in early 20th century Russia. They came from some other country, I don't really remember which one, but they're kind of rumored to be witches, and there's a lot of mystery about them amongst the people of the Russian court, but they are trying to get in with the queen, Tsarina Alexandra, excuse me. And so they do, but they're also very connected with Rasputin, which within that 150 or so pages, I still had not met Rasputin yet. He had not even come into the plot at all, not even a name mentioned or anything. Like I said, there were actively disgusting scenes having to do with their witchcraft that I just was not in for. Like I said, I was very apathetic to the characters. I just did not understand where they were coming from. I feel like this book should have started with them in their home country so we could get a better idea of their motivations, of where they came from, their expectations, before we just jumped right into the Russian court. So there was that. And then I ended up looking up reviews when I was considering DNFing it, and a lot of the reviews brought up the fact that particularly the second half of the book ends up being mostly focused based on sexual experiences with Rasputin, and he's not a very attractively described man in this book. And so I was like, you know what, I don't need to read that. Not my thing. I already don't care about these people and am already kind of grossed out, so I just put it down, and I would not recommend it. It was just not good. And I read it because I was doing, I think it was Bookopoly, Becca's Bookopoly-a-thon, and one of my challenges was to read the lowest rated book on my Goodreads, and this one was that, so I understand why now. Next, we have a classic that really makes me sad. It is Indiana by George Sand. This is a 19th century French classic by a French woman, which I feel like it's really hard to find female French authors that have been translated into English. So I was really excited to get into this because every French book I had read before this I had absolutely loved. Not that I've read that much, but I've read enough that I kind of was noticing a pattern that I tended to like French books. So I tried this being like, ooh, a female author, this could be great. And it started out great. And I think this is why it made me so angry, because I did start off being very interested in the plot and the writing style. The main character started off really intriguing me. I was just expecting it to be great. And it follows a young woman who her husband is kind of abusive and she's just very miserable, and she ends up meeting this guy who's very charming, of course, and who draws her in, which is normally not necessarily my favorite kind of story, so I didn't necessarily think it was going to be a favorite. It has potential though, because it's a topic that I feel like when it's done well and handled well, I actually can end up really loving it, but it often is not handled well in my eyes, and so I was a little nervous going into it on that front, but overall, especially within the first couple chapters, I was like, oh, I think this is gonna be good. And then we got to the second half of the book, and particularly the ending, and there was a character that I had enjoyed and found very interesting and was excited to learn more about. And he did some awful things in the end that I just could not stand. He turned out to be very melodramatic in a way that was not appealing or interesting to read. And the ending of this book seriously made me so angry. It was so terrible. It's like such a dramatic type, like tragic ending, but I just found it so uncomfortable to read because basically, without giving spoilers, there's a person who convinces the main character to do something with them that is really awful, and they just decide to do it due to basically impulsive and emotional reasons. And I just did not like it. It had so much potential, and then I ended up being really angry and uncomfortable. And I am getting rid of this book now because I was going to keep it to see if maybe in the future I'd reread it and like it better. But I'm like, just thinking about it, I'm like, I'm never gonna like this. Like, that plot point, the ending in particular, it's just never going to be gripping to me. I also felt like, despite the fact that this is a very short book, there was a portion in the middle that did drag. It was just ended up being very repetitive, and just, yeah, these scenes and moments and decisions that just get dragged out, and I just got bored and then angry. So yeah, very upset about that, but there you go. And the very bottom of my stack, this book that looked so cute. It's a middle grade. It looked magical and charming. It's not very long. It has illustrations. I was like, this is gonna be such a cute book. And then I ended and felt like I don't even know what I just read and what its purpose was or anything. And that is The Legend of the Dream Giants by Dustin Hansen. This book, so it follows a giant named Berg who is very rejected by society. They're all terrified of him because they think he's this particular giant who's known for like stealing and being awful and terrible and scary. And so he's very lonely. His mother somehow died is what we get hinted at, and a few magical things happen, and he meets different people. But first of all, this is the saddest middle grade I have ever read. Like, this is, I'm sure it will speak to certain middle graders who maybe are a little more on the angsty side, who will feel a little more seen by this book, because it's a lot of rejection that Berg is going through. There is not much real positive interaction that he gets throughout this whole book. Along with that, you see this girl on the cover. Yes, he meets a young girl who's very kind to him, classic, but she's barely in it. She doesn't even really have a solid personality. She's very generic, and we don't really get to know her very well at all. In my recent reads video where I talked about this book, I mentioned that I don't even know what age it's really for. It's a story that kind of feels like it could be put into a picture book and just kind of run through a lot faster than what this did. So it feels like it could be for people who are maybe just getting into chapter books and who like fairy tale kind of things and might like this. But then the author uses some kind of big words that feel more like it would be for like an 11, 12-year-old, maybe 10. Whereas the story itself, the plot itself, feels more for like 8 or 9-year-olds, and so it just felt like it was hard to tell where this would land age appropriateness wise. But on top of that, like I said, it's really sad, so I don't know if you'd even want a middle grader to read this because it's just really kind of heartbreaking. I mean, it has a happy ending, but that's the other thing, is the happy ending kind of comes out of nowhere. Like, just all of a sudden everything's fine and there's not really any real development to it. Throughout the book, this looked pretty in theory, but then it just ended up being kind of unnecessary. Like, it kind of brought some plot points together, but like not enough to like really make it necessary. And he has like these illustrations of Berg's dreams. Berg is having dreams about these bears, a mama bear and a baby bear, and they go on all these adventures and stuff, and a lot of it is events that are similar to what is happening in real life, and it sounds cute, right? It sounds sweet, especially it's called The Legend of the Dream Giants. Dreams are a big part of the outcome of this book. But that's the thing, they're a good part of the outcome, but there's only little like threads throughout the book that really focus on dreams, and nothing's like very focused. And for a middle grade, I would think that you would make things like that more obvious, so when it comes together in the end, you're like, oh yeah, I get that, that was enjoyable and sweet. Not here, folks, not here. It just did not connect very well for me. I don't understand what the point of this book was. It was really upsetting because I actually got this from the bookstore I work at for free. It was a recent release this past year, and I thought it just looked so beautiful. I mean, look at the gold, the cover is gorgeous. I mean, like inside we have the stars, like it looks so pretty. It has the illustrations. And so I was like, ooh, I want to try that so I know who I can recommend it to and if I should recommend it. Clearly I shouldn't, because unless someone asks me specifically for kind of a fairy tale-esque middle grade, I might suggest it because some people might like it, but to me, unfortunately, it was not good. It was also this author's debut novel, I'm pretty sure, and unfortunately, it just didn't go well. Like, it was so awful. So that is it. Those are my most disappointing / worst books of 2022. Let me know down below if you've read any of these, your thoughts on them. What are some of the most disappointing reads that you had this year? What is the most disappointing read you had this year? Specifically disappointing, not necessarily bad, but a book that you expected a lot more from that ended up just really disappointing you. I would love to know. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!